More medications, less health. Something's broken. Traditional medicine manages symptoms, but true healing addresses root cause. I'm Josh Rimini, pharmacist turned healer. At Beyond the Pills, we merge ancient wisdom with modern-day science to inspire you through stories of transformation, practical trainings, and holistic healing. Join me and other practitioners as we guide you towards vibrant health, body, mind, and spirit, and move beyond symptom management into true healing. All right, everybody, welcome to this episode of Beyond the Pills, where we explore the edge of healing, merging ancient wisdom with modern science, and today, the human right to live and die with dignity. I'm your host, Josh Rimini, pharmacist turned healer, and today's guest is a force for transformation in the fields of law, plant medicine, and end-of-life care. Professor Kathryn Tucker is a nationally recognized legal advocate, educator, and thought leader at the intersection of palliative care, psychedelic therapies, and death with dignity. Kathryn has served in leadership roles at organizations like National Psychedelics Association, Compassion and Choices, and the End of Life Liberty Project. She has taught law and ethics at institutions including Loyola Law School and the University of Washington, and currently teaches one of the first ever seminars on psychedelic law. She was lead counsel in the first federal case under the Right to Try Act, fighting for cancer patients access to psilocybin-assisted therapies. She now champions legal efforts to expand access to psilocybin for homebound patients and works to end discriminatory barriers in Oregon's psychedelic law. Today, we're going to explore things like the promise of psychedelics, especially psilocybin, in palliative care and end-of-life care, legal and ethical frontiers at the end of life, what yoga and consciousness practices can teach us about death, and how we can reimagine dying as a sacred, supported, and peaceful process. I no doubt know that this is going to be an expansive and essential conversation for you all. Welcome to the show, Kathryn.
Thank you so much. That's a lot to cover.
Well, I put those in there just for placeholders, but like I always ask the question now, it's like, how does it sound when you hear that coming from your bio? Like it's you, but it's like, you know, you've been in this trenches, if you will, for a very long time. And we had a really impactful conversation. The cancer warrior community is very dear to my heart, being a cancer survivor myself. And you've had such an impactful career. What first called you to work at this crossroads of law and end-of-life care?
Yeah, I have had a long career. I actually graduated law school 40 years ago this year. And most of those years, solid 35 of those years, I've been focused on advocacy to protect and expand the rights of dying patients. And I came into it somewhat randomly, you might say, but is anything ever really random? I had the opportunity as a very young lawyer in 1990 to work with a citizen advocacy group in the state of Washington that was preparing to put the first ever ballot measure to the voters in the state of Washington on the question of death with dignity. And that's what it was called at the time. And actually, that campaign came quite close to being the first state to enact such a law, and missed by a small margin. But that work then became the platform, the stepping stone for Oregon to have a successful effort a couple of years later. And in 1994, Oregon passed the nation's first Death with Dignity Act, which basically empowers people with terminal illness to ask their physician for a prescription for medication that the patient can ingest to achieve a more peaceful death. And that Oregon law, which required legal action to defend has now been in operation without interruption since 1998 and became the model for quite a few other states. And now, roughly 40% of people in the United States live in a jurisdiction where that option is legal. And it has become, quite sort of mainstreamed in those jurisdictions where people understand this is a right that they can choose. And, the modern medical realities are the good news is that modern medicine can extend life. The downside of that is sometimes it can create a dying process that is extremely extended and that the patient finds is lingering too long and they're trapped. And so this is an option for those who would rather avoid the last bit of suffering through a brutal experience with cancer or any other of the terminal illnesses. So that's really where I started. And that's now a long time ago. And I've gone on to do a lot of other things, all of which are at the intersect of law and medicine at the end of life.
I think it's such a powerful conversation because a lot of the times I think when we get to this stage of choice, right? This choice, you've been advocating for patients, people to have this choice at the end stage of life. And a lot of the times we don't, we've been taken out of choice. We've been taken into this place where a caregiver or a power of attorney or even a physician is making the choices to extend life to a particular place. Is like almost like going to the very end when someone may not want that or have their choice to do that. So I love that you've been in this space for so long.
Yeah,
And
no, absolutely. It's almost like a conveyor belt.
and
Uh,
after
it
that,
is.
right?
You get on the conveyor belt of treatments and interventions, and very little thought might be given once you're on that conveyor belt whether this is really beneficial. Is this really consistent with the preferences the individual who is moving through the dying process has for how they want to spend their final bit of life? And so, one of the things that's so important is to always be trying to keep that awareness as you are yourself moving through that process or supporting a loved one who is. And a lot of the choices and kind of the twists and turns on the path through terminal or advancing illness they're either poorly marked, they're unmarked, they're not mentioned. And so a lot of times patients and their supportive family and loved ones, they're not aware of what choices are available and how a particular choice might change the experience for the person approaching death.
Mm, powerful. It's such a nice way to like there's this legal side of an ethical component, right? And it's like having that choice is so important. I want to talk about this process now because that lifted you towards this next stage, right? This stage where we talked about, looking at psilocybin palliative care. So palliative, I've been a pharmacist my whole life practically. And now I'm kind of retired pharmacist, moved on into these new places where, I'm obviously a plant medicine advocate, but we know more about this potential, right, for psilocybin in relieving end of life anxiety, depression, suffering, and even accepting this next role, this next level of life, this thing that's going to go beyond this body. And in your mind, like where did you find this? Where was this part for you? Because this is a natural progression of your career. And I think it's huge. And I want to dive into this space, but I want to hear it from your like origin story. Like how did this
Yeah, right. Well, so having been in the arena of working to promote improved end of life care, I had witnessed in the 30 some years of that work that more choices were becoming available. For example, the choice for what is now called medical aid in dying, and the choice for more attentive and aggressive pain management, the expansion of access and earlier enrollment in hospice. All of these things were really positive developments that I witnessed in real time and celebrated. But the one gap in the palliative care toolbox that I was aware of that really had not seen evolution was a tool for relief of non-physical suffering. And that's where my excitement about psilocybin assisted therapy and making it available to people approaching death who have debilitating anxiety and depression and or existential distress about that are able to get relief. And the origin story for me was reading Michael Pollan's very excellent article in the New Yorker magazine way before he published his best-selling book. But the New Yorker magazine had an early story by Michael Pollan called The Trip Treatment. And this was probably back in 2017 or 2016. And he was speaking to the modern era clinical trials with psilocybin in patients with advanced cancer. And the findings were remarkable that a patient with debilitating anxiety and depression in advanced cancer who had a single guided session with psilocybin had immediate, substantial, and sustained relief. And the minute I read that, I just knew that I wanted to turn my attention to finding ways to make sure that that tool was brought to the bedside because it was the missing tool. And so in the wake of reading that article, I convened I think the first major national conference that brought together at the University of Washington School of Law, the modern era researchers, advocates, and others who were eager to see this tool become available. And we hosted a day-long conference called something like, a new palliative care tool on the horizon, psilocybin-assisted therapy. And it was a really important first conference from which, in which many seeds were planted that led to further work in this space. And I believe that at that conference, a physician specializing in hospice and palliative care, who later became and is still my client, attended, and that's Dr. Sunil Agarwal of the Advanced Integrative Medical Science Institute based in Seattle. And Dr. Agarwal treats people with advanced cancer. He already provides ketamine therapy at his clinic, which is a psychedelic adjacent drug, which is currently available. But it doesn't have all the benefits that psilocybin can offer. And he wanted to offer this to his patients who had really difficult, persistent depression and anxiety. So he did become my client a couple of years later, and we embarked into what has become a quite long effort to crack open the door to access. The reason why that door is closed is psilocybin sits on Schedule 1 of the Federal Controlled Substances Act, which means it is only accessible for research. And as a clinician providing therapeutic care, Dr. Agrawal wanted to use it not for research, but for therapeutic use. So, I cast about, as lawyers do, for legal theories that could benefit his goal, and came upon state and federal laws called right to try laws, which are designed to enable access to certain investigational drugs for people with life-threatening conditions, on the recognition that that population doesn't have the time to wait for the long, slow process of new drug approval. So for that population, early access to promising investigational drugs is to be allowed. And that is both state and federal law. And so when I saw those quite interesting laws, which are relatively new, and which were passed in the wake of a terribly sad, catalyzing experience of one family trying to get an experimental drug for their daughter, Abigail, who was dying of cancer. And the father, Frank Burroughs, was so adamant that his daughter needed the benefit of an experimental drug, and he fought so hard for it. And he filed a federal lawsuit saying that his daughter's right to access this drug should be a constitutionally recognized right. And he didn't prevail, but his case catalyzed the whole right to try movement, which then kind of swept the country in a firestorm with 41 states and the federal government all adopting these laws in the space of about 8 years, which is a very fast adoption rate. And the whole gestalt of these laws is the recognition of the urgency of people with terminal illness. So when I saw those laws, I looked over to see whether psilocybin, which is the drug in the clinical trials for relief of anxiety and depression in dying patients, whether it would fall within the ambit of these statutes. And I quickly determined that it did, because really the requirements are quite simple. The drug must have successfully completed a phase 1 clinical trial and remain under investigation. And that is true for psilocybin.
Yeah, now for sure.
Yeah. So we went with that in hand, we went to the DEA and we asked it how it would allow Dr. Agarwal access. The sticking point is that we did find suppliers of psilocybin who were willing to supply Dr. Agarwal. However, the shipment of a Schedule 1 drug can only be done to an entity that has a Schedule 1 license. And that was the sticking point, because, of course, that's the research license, which Dr. Agarwal does not hold and does not want to hold. So we went over to the DEA, and this would have been back in 2022, and asked it to allow access, and it refused. And we then embarked into a series of lawsuits, which are probably too long and boring to go too deep into the weeds for your watchers. But one of the lawsuits was asserting that the right to try required the DEA to open a path to access. And another was to petition the DEA to move psilocybin off of Schedule 1. And of course, there have been many leading scientists, and the one who comes immediately to mind is Matthew Johnson at Johns Hopkins, who has been among the leaders of the modern era clinical research, along with Roland Griffiths, who recently passed away, but who was a big supporter of this advocacy that I'll be describing, and actually joined our lawsuit as what's called a friend of the court, or an amici. And Matthew Johnson has said that placement of psilocybin on Schedule 1 is absurd, that it never belonged there, and that it ought be moved off. And he and his team at Johns Hopkins wrote a really outstanding paper, which we attached to our petition to reschedule, outlining exactly why in some excruciating scientific detail. So for your science nerds, you can pull that up. And so that petition was rejected by the DEA, and we had to sue it again. And we did succeed in that litigation, with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals doing what's called remanding the matter back to the agency to do its job and handle the petition properly, which, by the way, we finally have seen that happen this week, when the DEA has now transmitted that petition over to HHS and FDA, which are the agencies with scientific and medical expertise, inviting their scientific and medical evaluation and scheduling recommendation. That's a big deal, and it's all over the news today because first, the DEA finally did what it ought to have done in making that transmittal. That is newsworthy, sadly. But these agencies, we know, have already taken a really close look at psilocybin. How do we know that? Because the agency, the FDA, has twice granted what's called breakthrough status. And that is an official designation that is given to certain investigational drugs if if the FDA determines that that investigational drug provides benefit above and beyond approved drugs. That's a big deal to get breakthrough status, and it has been twice given already to psilocybin. So when this petition lands over at these agencies, HHS and FDA, they'll be able to quickly say, oh, yes, we did take a real close look recently, and we've already afforded breakthrough status. So we're able to quickly pivot and return this petition with our very strong scientific and medical review over to DEA, and we can provide that scheduling recommendation to move it off Schedule 1. So that's a really exciting moment.
Yeah, it's from the pharmacy side of things, right? For the listeners, Schedule 1 means no medicinal value. That's why the DEA schedules it at 1. Like Schedule 2, 3, 4, 5, those are drugs that can be prescribed and monitored. That's a pharmacy. That's what we do. We monitor. And so things like hydrocodone, oxycodone, those are Schedule 2 drugs. Schedule 1 drugs means the FDA has said, or the DEA has said, there's no medicinal use to them. This is where cocaine, heroin. And so you're right. I want to back that up because psilocybin has no right being a Schedule 1 drug. It has plenty of medical use. It's been documented many times, and it has no LD50. It cannot kill you. Like, we know that there's a safety profile. So it's kind of like they lumped all the psychedelics in class 1, and now we're moving into this space of like moving the healing processes of psilocybin, MDMA. These are the ones that are being closely looked at right now. So thank you for bringing that to light from that legal perspective. There's a big process to moving it through that process. I have more questions about decrimmed and all that stuff, but right now, and we'll get into that. So I also love that study. I'm glad that you brought the person through with John Hopkins, because that was the study, I think, in 2016, where they took these advanced cancer patients and they went on a high dose psilocybin 1 treatment, psychedelic-assisted therapy here. So it wasn't just they took it and then they went off. They were assisted through psychotherapy. 80% of those participants had a substantial reduction in depression and anxiety, with positive effects lasting 6 months or longer. So this is where that breakthrough status comes in. Like, these things are beautiful. And from a spiritual side of things, the reason we have this reduction in anxiety and reduction in depression in end-of-life cancer warriors is because in one way, and I've read Michael Pollan's stuff too, like that was a really great segue into here, is because he opened the doors for a lot of people, especially with his book, How to Change Your Mind. It's like the starter book for anybody that wants to get into this. And he goes into the book too, and in some of these things where it's not just that clinical aspect of reducing anxiety and depression, it's this acceptance of end of life. Because in these spiritual, if you want to call them that, enlightening experiences with psilocybin, is these cancer patients start to see that they in their own way see that there is something beyond this body. There's this life beyond life. And I feel, and whether you believe it or not is okay, but the people that took medicine, that's what reduces that anxiety and depression, is because they start to accept that, and they feel, not just see like analytically, there's a felt knowledge that there's something bigger than me. There's something bigger beyond. And I feel like that's probably one of those causalities, and obviously not in the studies, but like I want the listeners to know like what's really going on is because they have this non-ordinary state of consciousness where it's kind of like a near-death experience. If you study near-death experiences, people that over half of them have gone into this space that says, I was on a different realm. It was more real than this real, da 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 da. And it's because they know that there might be something more. And that I think that's important for people reaching that term of relief. For me, having been through journeys myself, like there's this relief for me that I'm not as afraid of. I want to live as long as I can in this beautiful body, in this incarnation I'm in, but I also carry this new sense of knowing that there's something greater, and I know there's something beyond this realm. And that to me is a big deal of why this is so important for these beautiful cancer warriors moving through that journey. So
Most certainly. Yeah, most certainly. And, this will take us a little bit far afield, but I have spent in parallel to my work of more than 30 years in the law and advocacy on behalf of improving the dying experience. In parallel to that, I have, for all of those years also been very deeply involved personally in the yoga tradition teachings and practices. And I think everything you just said is certainly very well observed and recognized in those wisdom traditions. And the idea of those traditions is that you catalyze the elevated and expanded state of consciousness through your yogic practices.
right. Yeah.
And that's a dedication that I have in my own life. And I believe it is a very trustworthy way to catalyze those states of consciousness. And I'm always inviting people to consider doing that in their own life. And yet, for people that don't have 30 years to give to the cultivation of those practices, who find themselves confronted possibly suddenly and unexpectedly with a terminal diagnosis, and they are catapulted into states of anxiety and depression, having a medicine that will facilitate the entry into those expanded states of consciousness with the results that you just described is a wonderful thing. And so we have that in psilocybin. And and it's a really exciting tool. And this is why you see, for example, my client, Dr. Sunil Agarwal, who's been in leadership of a psychedelic interest group within the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, which is the large national group of clinicians who practice in this specialty. And that specialty is really eager to bring this tool to the bedside for their patients nationwide. And so kind of the burgeoning excitement in that community about this coming to hand is really motivating, my continued work. I mean, you might say to yourself, wow, it took 3+ years to get the DEA to move the petition over to HHS. And it's true. And that's unfortunate that it took that long and that we had to sue the agency and that it still was very slow. But now it has done the transmittal. And as I said, hopefully we can have smoother sailing forward and see this tool become available in short order.
I love that. And thank you for bringing in the yoga. It was like my next question. Is moving, because we are talking, it's not just like the physical realm or the mind body, like emotional health. There's that spiritual aspect to all of life, and knowing that this medicine works in these different realms, if you will. Cause I love taking my clients through body, mind, and spirit, or energy, or whatever you want to call that. And, when someone is highly in their spiritual practice, whether it's yoga, there's plenty of different ways to look at that. You don't have to take a psychedelic to get to a higher state of consciousness. This is where the work of yoga and these ancient practices and meditation, and also the scientific side of these things, are coming through now. But these tools that we have, and I love that you're putting this beautiful perspective of how beautiful these tools are, but how difficult it is today and age to make them happen, because that's just the way we're in. It's like we're moving into this golden age where, and these beautiful avengers like yourself who are we're bringing this advocacy towards it, which all that hard work and all that heavy lifting, hopefully, a generation from now, we're going to have much more access to people guiding their way, not only through their own healing journeys, but also towards this. I love this conversation because we hardly talk about healing at the end of life. And this is where I feel like this is beautiful in that space.
Yeah, well, and if I could say too, while my interest and focus has been on patients approaching death through terminal illness, I want to say that another quite profound application of psilocybin is to relieve anxiety, depression as manifests in PTSD for veterans.
Yeah.
And that's a population where, sadly, the statistics are something on the order of 22 to 25 veterans a day achieve death by suicide. And that can be avoided by application of this medicine. And so, sadly, what's happening is veteran advocacy groups are taking veterans who served this country to countries other than this to get this medicine. They are flying veterans to Mexico, Peru, South America, Jamaica. They are taking them out of the United States, the country they served, to get the medicine they need to recover, and then to go on and live long and productive lives. And so another application, and if we're successful with this movement off of Schedule 1, is clinicians who are seeing people at risk of suicide are certainly seeing people with life-threatening conditions. And those people, too, will be the beneficiary under these right-to-try laws, where access to psilocybin could happen even prior to FDA approval, because that's the point of those laws. And so I like to also respect that community, very worthy of our concern and attention, and also potential beneficiary of this work.
And I love that. That's like, it's, yes, especially treatment refractive PTSD. In other words, psychotherapy and all this pharmacology in the world didn't even reduce a symptom to getting to cure rates upwards of 70% using psilocybin, MDMA, these things that MAPS are using in their studies and bringing towards that FDA approval. But I love that part that you put on is like the access to these now based upon the law of right to try, because these PTS, suicidal ideation, and these PTSDs. And yes, this is what's happening. And I've had a lot of conversations on this podcast and with other colleagues is we want to treat these vets because it's so needed for them. And then we got to throw them over here into these spaces where we don't really have control of the process. They get, they go through a therapy, then they get thrown back, and sometimes they're not integrating enough. And, but it's part of the process today. You got to go where you can go to get it. And that's why I love like having collaborative efforts with people in these places, doing these retreats in the right fashion, because that's where we're at. But I love that part where you're like, because of the necessity today with these types of people, these clients that have these debilitating problems, they do have that right to try, which I don't think I've ever heard of it from that perspective, from that PTSD space. So thank you for that. That's really awesome.
Yeah, yeah. And they have been, veterans, when you have a big piece of public interest advocacy, as we have been moving forward with Dr. Sunil Agarwal as the tip of the spear, so to speak, you do collaborate along the way. And so, for example, this umbrella organization called the Veterans Mental Health Leadership Coalition has come into these cases that I've mentioned as friend of the court amici. And that's really useful to bring in these important voices. We also had nearly all of the modern era researchers come in and join briefs as amici to really share the scientific perspective. Now, another moment, which I hope will come to pass in the not too distant future, where those voices will be very valuable, is when the HHS and FDA have finished their medical scientific review and have made the scheduling recommendation that they're going to make, the matter then transfers back to the DEA because of this division of power between these federal agencies, at which time the DEA should, pursuant to the normal process that governs this petition, should issue what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking. And that's a notice that's published in the Federal Register. It typically generates considerable awareness in the medical and scientific communities and in the advocacy communities, and a public comment period opens, at which time everyone with an interest in this issue of where psilocybin ought be placed on the schedules of the Controlled Substances Act can submit a public comment. And so I like to kind of flag that so that all your listeners who may be in leadership of different research efforts or scientific institutes who have something powerful to say in that comment period are sharpening their pencils and getting ready to put in a public comment.
Yeah, I think we've gotten to this place, I believe, especially with all the conversations and all the advocacies and all the groups of the psychedelic science of this part of medicine. We've got an army building now. I feel like this is the tipping point now. Here's another one. Like you said, this is breaking news. This is moving it out of the realm of like washing it away or denying it. It's like there's a space that has this like flywheel of momentum where things are going to happen, right?
Yeah, things are happening. And I mean, I should say in this conversation would probably not be complete if we didn't at least touch on the fact that this burgeoning interest in it and excitement and recognition of the value of bringing this medicine to the bedside is causing the states to jump out ahead of the federal government. So your listeners probably are aware that the state of Oregon adopted a psilocybin act through the initiative process back in 2020. And then the state of Colorado followed. Most recently, the state of New Mexico. And New Mexico, very interestingly, and in contrast to Oregon and Colorado, has adopted the matter through the legislative process rather than the initiative process, which means that the legislators, who often are unwilling to take on what might be considered controversial matters, felt comfortable that this matter was not controversial and merited respect in the state legislative process. And the other really different thing about the New Mexico model is that it is medicinal. And that's in stark contrast to Oregon and Colorado, which are adult use measures. And I have plenty to comment about that, should you like to get into that. But I think the important thing, the big picture thing, is to say, the states have been unwilling to wait for the federal government to make its reforms. Now, having said that, as a lawyer, I am constantly feeling obligated to remind everyone that states can only change state law. They cannot alter federal law. So even though these programs are up and running in Oregon and Colorado and soon in New Mexico, there is no federal protection. There's no federal safe harbor. And so those who are choosing to participate in the programs in those states remain exposed to federal prosecution and punishment, which is no small thing.
Yeah, well, and it's very in line with other types of plant medicines, right? Like cannabis, right? We're going everything's statewide, and then there's no federal, so there's no guarantees. But and then you can talk about the religious components and things like that. So are you talking in Colorado and Oregon and now New Mexico? Is that, just so people know, is that similar to the decriminalization?
No. So a couple of
Talk to
things.
people a little bit about the difference, because I feel like that's really important to get that awareness.
Yeah, I mean, couple of things. First of all, you mentioned cannabis, and the thing to keep in mind is in the early days of medical cannabis, there were prosecutions and punishments. And only over time did the federal government adopt a policy of refraining when a state had legalized and regulated. That has not happened yet with regard to psilocybin, and we don't know if it will. There is no, as your very attuned listeners might remember, the Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice, adopted a policy called the Cole Memorandum that said if a state has legalized and regulated marijuana, the feds will stand down from enforcing federal law. That kind of a policy memo or position has not been adopted by the US DOJ vis-a-vis psilocybin. So the exposure is real, and we have seen the feds decide to enforce what's called the crack house provision, or what's referred to as the crack house provision of the Controlled Substances Act, which says any use of a premises with drugs that are banned by the Controlled Substances Act will be a criminal act exposed to federal enforcement. We've seen that enforcement vis-a-vis the safe injection sites. If you've been following that, where advocates have hoped to reduce drug overdose by opening injection sites, which will be supervised and staff available to reverse the effects of an overdose. That's a laudable public health purpose. Those have been shut down by the federal government using the crack house provision of the CSA. So I don't think that operators, for example, of service centers in Oregon can feel safe or have reason to feel safe from federal enforcement. Now, you mentioned decriminalization. That's a very different topic. We have seen a lot of advocates around the country, mostly in municipalities. So I think Denver went first, and then you saw a flurry of other municipalities, Santa Cruz, Cambridge, Ann Arbor, Seattle, all of these kind of progressive municipalities adopting provisions that say, we will make the enforcement of law against access to these substances our lowest enforcement priority. That's different than affirmatively legalizing.
Sure.
And I don't, really advocate in the decrim world myself, because my experience in representing people with advanced illness and the providers who care for them is that they are not willing to step outside the bounds of the law.
Yeah, especially for mental care providers.
Yeah,
That's a lot of conversations I'm having now with providers is they're stuck, right? They believe in this. There's this preparation phase and an integration phase, totally easy to do, but like that space where you're ingesting this class 1 narcotic and you're moving it into this space, even if it's deep, like it's a sticky space because there's good fear in there. There's fear that I could go to jail, lose my license, do the thing. Like all of that is real because of the law, right? Law. Yeah. And I love that you're bringing this up, because I think that was important for people, because I think when they hear decrim,
I can go to this place and everything's fine. Nobody's gonna do anything because they're looking the other way. But it's not quite like that,
It's not like that. It's not like that. It is like an ostrich with the head in the sand, to ignore the reality of potential federal enforcement. Um, and yet, there are those who do sort of a form of civil disobedience, really, of just saying, if this can prevent that suicide, if this can make that death peaceful, I'm going to take that risk. But the risk is there, and I think we just have to be aware of it.
Yeah, and I think that's perfect. Like that's your job, right? The job is to show people their risk awareness and help them make informed, confident decisions around this process.
Yeah.
But at least and this space is really this open container today is really to show people we are moving in the direction that we need to, that this is real, that these things are valuable, and hopefully we'll get to that place where we can prove the safety, the efficacy, and the need for these types of modalities. So thank you for enlightening us in that space.
Yeah. And then kind of circling back a little bit to, how wisdom traditions of various kinds can be really powerful when one is contemplating end of life. What I had spent a lot of years of my career going to conferences where I'd be on a podium at, say, the Anaheim Convention Center or some kind of soulless large ballroom of a hotel. And people would be sitting at their little tables listening to a presentation about the different choices that people have at the end of life. I did that for a long time. And then I really came to feel that very sterile environment where, a speaker was trying to convey some information about these different choices, it wasn't an optimum environment for people to receive that information. And I designed a workshop that I offer at retreat centers now around the world, where people come for a day or a weekend to really kind of step out of their normal life and step out of the sterile ballroom, conference room experience and drop into some very basic yogic practices with movement and breath to invite a contemplative frame of mind. And when that frame of mind has been catalyzed, we do some bit of learning of what those choices are. But then we also team that up with some immersion in an exploration of wisdom tradition teachings that may help a person consider which choices are most consistent with their preferences. And that kind of package, I feel, is a really beautiful way for people who want to really dive into thinking about, what do I want my last bit of this lifetime to involve? And what choices will facilitate that experience unfolding? And so that's really kind of a project of mine that weaves together both my knowledge of law and policy in this domain and my understanding of and reverence for wisdom tradition teachings that bear on these topics. And they're interwoven in these workshops. And I think the people that are called to attend are really ready to do a deep immersive dive, whether it's because they are themselves with a diagnosis and they're suddenly starkly confronted with the need to do this work, or because they're supporting a loved one and really want to be an informed supporter. And so the people really self-select for when they're ready for this kind of a workshop. But it's always a great privilege and pleasure to be with people who want to do that work.
Yeah, and it is a really good segue, because I think a lot of the draw we both had in our initial conversation is is we're looking at the law, right? That would be like the modern day part of this. And then there's that spiritual ancient practice that's fused together, right? This the essence of this podcast is ancient wisdom meets modern science. It's together. It's not one or the other. And I love how you brought that up, is because the best healing, the best contemplative, transfer ourselves out of our day, we immerse ourselves into unplugging into this so we can put our full awareness, our full consciousness of knowing and moving from thinking to doing and becoming, right? And so this is another way to go to a retreat, and you hold these, right? You're coming up with one. I think you're aren't you coming up with one soon?
Yeah, I offer these kind of
Because
intermittently.
I think this is so important for people, is unplugging and learning through experience where this essence of this stuff is. So where can people find information about this retreat?
Yeah, so the next one I have, which is actually just around the corner in September, I think we're September 19 through 21 at Kripalu Center for Yoga and Wellness in the Berkshires. And many of your listeners may know about Kripalu. I think it's in its 50th year. It may be the oldest North American retreat center for yoga and wellness. And I'm returning there. I offered this workshop a couple of years ago. I'm really delighted to be invited back. And I have a co-leader who is an end-of-life doula, which is kind of a new-ish additional service that people are able to access as they think about end of life. And it's really a nice additional kind of caring beyond what you might expect from hospice. And so I'm really excited to team with a legendary end-of-life doula. And we'll be offering this over those 3 days. And we'll take a really deep dive into both, what the law allows, what kind of choices are commonly confronted, but often not revealed, so that people will be empowered with this information. And then through our efforts to really drop into contemplative frame of mind, we'll evaluate those choices through the lens of some wisdom tradition teachings. And I think when people leave, they feel very empowered and kind of excited about, the opportunity that the last bit of this lifetime has to be a psychospiritual transformation. And that's a really exciting way to think about your last bit of lifetime, instead of something to be denied or ignored or combated or feared.
And that's awesome. I love that. I love that you brought in the end of life doula, because when I was in Peru and my ceremonies, when I was going through my healing last year, one of the facilitators that was there just helping along the side in the retreat center, she was a death doula. I never heard of that before. So I was there for 2 weeks, and she was one of the facilitators. So I got to learn more about that part of this whole process. And I think tag teaming like your expertise in that, I feel like, is a really good space to just immerse yourself. And I love the fact that you use, like, you don't have to be terminal to start contemplating this. Like, this is part of the process of life. And it's kind of like when I do genomics testing on someone, it's like, you can do it when you're 9 or when you're 90. I'm still going to do the same test. And so getting it a little ahead of the curve also can be very beneficial to living life in the moment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is why, of course, in the physical posture practice of yoga, for any who have ever been in a yoga practice, know the final posture, the final asana, is called shavasana, which means corpse pose. And unfortunately, often an instructor might only refer to that as deep relaxation. And it is deep relaxation. And it is in that relaxation that you receive the benefit of the practice. However, it is also to remind each of us mortals that, in fact, each of these bodies will be a corpse. And that awareness is so that we can practice dying a little bit every day. And that transforms the experience of this lifetime and prepares us for the death time.
I love that. So, where can people learn more about your work in upcoming events like this event you're having at Kripalu at the workshop?
Yeah. So at the moment, across the span of my career, I've been with a number of different nonprofits, and I'm currently with a nonprofit that is relatively new called the National Psychedelics Association. So everyone can find that on the web, and we are working on kind of standing up a website that will have the legal filings in this advocacy that I've been discussing. And that's also, a big process for a new nonprofit to get that all going. This is a nonprofit that is eager to find philanthropists that want to support its work to get up a really great website and share all this information. But you can also find information about the workshop on the Kripalu website, and that's KRIPALU, Kripalu. And maybe you can post the link to the workshop.
We'll share the link
in the show notes. But, I would also be remiss to close without mentioning that all the work that I've described around opening access to psilocybin-assisted therapy has been funded by philanthropy. And I like to say no donation is too small or too large. And I think our donors have been as small as $100 and as large as $150,000. And so there's kind of a big span in the donors, but we value them all. And none of this work happens. I'm not charging Dr. Agarwal or his dying cancer patients. And none of this work happens without philanthropic support. So those donations can go to the National Psychedelics Association Foundation, which is a 501c3. So it's a charitable donation, and it supports and makes possible all of this cutting edge advocacy.
Oh, I love that. That's so dear and true. And so thank you for leading that charge and giving out of that space, because I think the energy does come back in spades, right? It comes back in this way where we are putting that ripple into the universe. We're putting this energy out that we're gifting, but we're also receiving, because we're getting how many souls can be saved if we can move this in this new way, right? Not just the energetics and the shamanic work of, it's like real. This is real life things that we're doing, and we're impacting legacy. We're impacting lives, and we're impacting families. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
What message would you offer, or what's the one thing you want the listeners who are who either fear death or avoid the topic entirely? What's one thing you want them to know out of this conversation?
That the nearing death experience, that being in the crucible, the fire of awareness that death is impending, is a moment in this lifetime that only comes once in this lifetime and can be like a jet propelled psychospiritual transformation. It will be the most powerfully transformational period, no matter how long you've sat on your cushion or on your yoga mat or with your mantra or whatever your practice is. There's something very unique about confronting that last bit, and that's really something to look forward to and be excited about.
What a beautiful way to say that, because when you think about that moment, it's a huge moment in someone's life. It's beyond words. And so putting that light onto it being a positive experience, I think, is such a beautiful thing.
Something to look forward to.
I love that. What a nice way to place that, and what a nice bookend to this conversation.
Well, a pleasure to be with you, Josh. Thank you so much for having me. And any listeners that want to follow up can find me on LinkedIn, where I post about my work. and developments in the work. And they can find me at the National Psychedelics Association on email, etc. So please be in touch if you have a capacity to support or advance this work.
We'll share those links. Find her on LinkedIn. Awesome. Kathryn, thank you so much for all you're doing in this world. You can wait to dive in a little bit more, be a referral system for your retreats and the work that you're doing.
Hope to see you at Kripalu.
I would love to. Not this round, but I would love to witness and see this process, because it is part of this beautiful human equation that we're all living right now. So
hope to see you. All right. Thank you.
Guys. That's a wrap. Until next time, stay well.
Thanks for joining me today on Beyond the Pills. If our mission to de-prescribe 10 million unnecessary medications resonates with you, share this episode, subscribe, and leave a review. Whether you're a practitioner or someone ready to reclaim your health, visit rx2wellness.com for free resources to begin your journey. Together, let's go beyond the pills and co-create a world of vibrant health and true healing. Until next time, live better and stay well.